Welcome back to Intro to Physical Anthropology. I'm your instructor, David Leitner, and this time we're going to talk about culture. Last video, we talked about how probably much of what larger brains were being selected for were specific kinds of intelligence, particularly those that enable sociality and eventually culture as well. But what is culture, after all? It's important we sort of keep in mind that one of the keys to the success of the genus Homo is culture. It's the development of this ability to adapt our behavior within our lifetimes to different environments and different stimuli in very creative ways. And our ability to live in large groups with one another. So, let's find out what culture is. The first definition of culture in the anthropological literature comes to us from E.B. Tylor in 1871. For him, culture was, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Now, there's some important things to understand here. At this time, the word culture was actually sort of associated with the idea of high culture, like art and classical music and literature and so forth. So to be cultured was to be sort of, have access to the social capital of the elite. He's defining it in a completely different way. He's saying it's not just high culture, it's everything around us. And it's not just creative endeavors. It's what we believe. It's what we know and how we know it. It is our morality, the morals we have come to us through culture. Our laws, our customs, anything that we acquire, because we're not inborn with these things, anything that we acquire as part of a society. And that's an important thing here. I've got my own take on culture, which is that it shares a number of these traits. Culture is acquired, it's not inborn. So, a great example is language. Language is part of culture, and all of us are born with the facility to acquire a language. That's a genetically hardwired sort of piece of our biological being. But there's nothing in us that's genetically hardwired for Spanish or English or any other language in the world. Like, all of the languages come to you because you acquire them, you learn them. Culture is shared because we all generally know what it is. If it's a cultural norm that just one person has and nobody else sort of shares that, it's not really culture. It's just somebody's quirky way of behaving. But it's also negotiated. So even if we all share it, we can have different takes on what it means. The flag is a great example of this. The American flag. For some people, it's a symbol of freedom and democracy. For others, it's a symbol of colonialism and oppression. Those are both equally valid ways of reading that symbol because people occupy different positions in this culture and experience that flag and the way it's been used by people in different ways. Cultures are complex, and that means their elements are interrelated with one another. They have to be sort of seen within the context of the whole culture and not from exterior judgment criteria. You have to see things, when you're studying a culture, you have to understand it from the inside. It includes symbols and knowledge, so it's mental and psychological in a lot of ways, but it's not just. It also includes practices and habits, the things we actually do. It's not enough to just think a thing, but doing it also has a different effect on the way it occurs in the world. Most of culture is tacit. That means we don't know what we know. Oftentimes, there are rules of culture you don't know until somebody breaks them. Like, you know, probably if I asked you some elements of American culture, the first thing to pop into your mind is not going to be people don't stand too close to each other. Because you just assume that that's the way the world is. You know, that there's this boundary, and where you draw that boundary is just kind of that's the way the world is. Well, different cultures draw that boundary in different places, and tolerate different distances from one another. So that's an example of tacit knowledge of your culture. Finally, the important thing about culture is it is, because it's both shared and negotiated, it's always adapting and changing. So it is able to do within a lifetime what would have taken generations of mutation and natural selection would have if we went the old biological evolutionary route. You want a simpler definition? It's everything you take for granted about the world, and it's mostly stuff you don't know. That's a brief take. Don't take this to your anthropology professor, though, as gospel. Okay, so what does it mean that we have culture? Well, we are biocultural beings. We are biocultural creatures. So our behavior is not simply dictated by genetics and our biology. It also produces these kinds of behaviors that produce their own phenomenon called culture. And biology can shape culture, but culture can also shape biology in return. Some people call this the nature versus nurture debate. And that's a false dichotomy, okay? Being biocultural means that our collective behavior can put selective pressures on biology and vice versa. The best metaphor I've heard for this comes from John Marx. He says you can separate nature from culture and human behavior about as well as you can separate the eggs and flour from a cake. A cake is a cake, and you can't unmake a cake, right? It takes the eggs and the flour wrapped together and undergoing transformation in order to make a cake. And you can't undo that. Well, it's the same thing with culture and biology. In humans, they work together. Some great examples of biocultural interactions are slash and burn agriculture and the prevalence of sickle cell genes in particular areas. Sickle cell is an adaptation to the presence of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. A lot of places where slash and burn, and this is not sort of burning down the Amazon slash and burn, this is localized swiddening. Slash and burn agriculture on a relatively small scale that produces a rotation of crops every few years. So you sort of work one field for a few years, and as it runs out of nutrients, you slash and burn another one, and then another and another, and by the time you get back to the first field, it's full of nutrients again. So you slash and burn again. Well, that also tends to, for two reasons, if you're doing these in rainforests, then that will create areas where water may collect, but also a lot of places, the crop that is put into place is something like rice, which includes an aquatic period where there's lots of water. Where there's water, mosquitoes lay their larvae, so large mosquito populations. Large mosquito populations put pressure that encourage the sickle cell trait because people who have one copy of the sickle cell gene have resistance to malaria, even though people with two copies of the gene develop sickle cell anemia, which is potentially fatal. Okay. That is our behavior, slash and burn, creating biological conditions for mosquitoes to breed, which in turn changes the prevalence of a disease, which produces selective pressures on our gene pool. Okay, that's a biocultural interaction. Another one that we've talked about previously is lactase persistence and herding. Lactase persistence genes are basically just breaks in the genes that turn off the production of lactase in mammals once they've sort of gotten beyond suckling. In humans, this appears to happen on a semi-regular basis. These mutations will pop up. Well, under normal circumstances, if you aren't ingesting milk, there's no reason to have lactase. So it doesn't matter that you are still producing it. But if you live in a society that has begun to herd animals and relies on milk, that then gives you an extra source of nutrition during famines, okay, which gives you a selective advantage, increases the prevalence of that gene in those areas. So that is why the places where we find the highest rates of lactase persistence in the world are also places that have long histories of herding. There again, you've got this interaction between a behavioral trait, a cultural trait that is herding animals and eating dairy products, and a biological trait which has no advantage under normal circumstances in humans, but once you start consuming dairy products, it has great selective advantages. So there again, the behavior puts pressures and alters the way evolution happens. So that is a biocultural interaction as well. The key thing to understand here is, in terms of how this relates to the brain, is that in order to acquire culture, you have to be encultured. Because we acquire cultures, and because our cultures nowadays are so complex, we have extensive childhoods, far longer periods of juvenile periods than any other primate, any other mammal. That is entirely so we can acquire our cultures. And as we acquire our cultures, our brains finish growing. We aren't born with all of our instincts and everything in place. Our brains have to selectively grow over this long period of time of childhood and adolescence. Those brains start from genes, okay? They start growing and organizing from genes, but even before you're out of the womb, environmental sensations are shaping that brain. They're strengthening some connections while others get weaker. And then by about the age of 2, the process of pruning unneeded connections has gotten in full swing. And, all the way up till the age of 2, you're profusely growing new branches on your neurons. You're just thickening the network up there. And by then, things start to prune away. Things you aren't going to use start to disappear. And that's a good thing, because it actually lets the signals get through more faithfully. So the channels that are the strongest survive, and those also tend to be the ones that, as they get stronger, you will get better. Your fine motor control will, by the age of 4 or 5, start dialing in. Different cognitive steps occur as certain pathways get stronger than others. So enculturation and brains are intimately tied together, and intimately tied with this fact that we have long juvenile periods. So an encultured brain, an example of this is language. An example of enculturation is language. We are all born with the ability to acquire language, and we have a period of time, especially in the first sort of 5 or 6 years, when we seem to be almost primarily wired to do that, to acquire a language. We do it very effortlessly during that time period. As we get older, it's a little harder to acquire languages. But if we've already acquired a second language, it'll be easier to acquire a third and a fourth, and so forth. And some people in the past regularly spoke multiple languages. yeah, that being monolingual is kind of a historical weirdness. Uh, but the specifics of language are not baked into your brain. You have a capacity to learn language, but you don't have the language in there yet. That is an example of an encultured trait, right? It's an interaction between the biology and genetics and the culture that you are born into. My other favorite example of this, and then I'll sort of leave off of this topic, is known as the knowledge. So in London, the drivers of black cabs, the fancy sort of stereotypical sort of London cab, have to take a test to get their license, and it takes years to get this test. People fail it multiple times before succeeding, and it consists of basically memorizing every street name, every direction, every address of every landmark and place that is in London, to the extent that you don't need to look up on a map how to get from point A to point B in the most effective way. And you'll know what times of days to do it as well. It is a grueling exercise in memory. One of the most interesting things about it, though, is there was a study done of cabbies studying for the knowledge. And over the course of their training, there was measurable growth in the hippocampi of these students, these student cabbies, right? That is an area of the brain associated with memory formation. So they were essentially building up these mental maps of the entire city of London. And the greater city of London is massive. Massive, massive, massive. It's not a tiny city. It's huge. Even more interesting, when they went to study retired cabbies, they found out that after cabbies retired, the further out from retirement they were, the longer they've been retired, the more their hippocampi shrunk back to its normal size. So this is a massive change in your brain going on when you do this. It is changing the physical structures of your brain in a significant way. Your brain is constantly changing. Your brain is constantly forming new structures and tearing down old ones. That is what it does. That is how it produces you. Okay? And that is the most incredible thing about why culture is so important to our lives. It is a fundamentally biological and cultural phenomenon. Human beings need culture to survive. That is the fundamental principle here. That is our chief selective advantage in the late Pleistocene, as many, many, many other species across the world were dying out because of massive temperature changes on 41 to 100,000 year cycles, right? Going repeated ice ages. That is what got us through it. And it's why we're the only ones left standing. Next time, I want to go deeper into language. How did it evolve? What are the structures involved? Where do we think it comes from? Why do we think it developed? That sort of thing. Until next time, thank you very much. Have a great week, and I will see you soon.